Montgomery Jones and the Search for the Lost World of Fantasy by LH Damelin, read by Peter Gilchrist. Chapter 1. It was the strangest, most wonderful house that Douglas Walker had ever seen. On one side rose the turrets and spires of a castle with ancient moss-covered stones and rusty cannon barrels glaring out of gaps in the masonry. On the other side, the house was a stately mansion with marble pillars, large windows, embedded ivy-coloured walls, and a roof of slate tiles sprouting a profusion of brick chimneys. The castle and mansion were joined in the middle by a tall brick tower which looked somewhat like a lighthouse as it was crowned with a shiny dome. Now the dome had a huge circular window that peered out of the countryside like the eye of a cyclops, while at the very top of the tower was an old weathercock, which did not appear to be in working order, but it certainly served as an appropriate finishing touch to this very peculiar dwelling. And all this was perched rather precariously on the summit of an odd-shaped, crestless hill, seeming the victim of a poor-sighted giant who had mistaken it for a hard-boiled egg and knocked its top off with a colossal butter knife. There was no doubt that the house was extremely old, but while some houses become grand with age, this one hadn't. In fact, it was in a rather bad state of neglect, particularly the mansion portion. Plastered walls were not concealed with ivy, were cracked and peeling, and a host of weed-choked gutter pipes protruded from the roof in all directions, like bent needles sticking out of a shabby pincushion. A short distance from where Douglas stood, at one end of the narrow stone path that spiralled around the hill before coming to an end, at a large oak door at the foot of the tower, was an old letterbox with a tarnished brass plaque. It read, 54 Springdale Avenue. "Oh, Mother, how could you?" Douglas exclaimed incredulously when seeing the plaque and discovering to his great astonishment and panic that what was inscribed on it matched the very address on the piece of paper he was holding. Eccentric is one thing, but this is just plain weird, thought Douglas, staring at the house in disbelief and recalling with renewed resentment the conversation he'd had with Mother just a few weeks ago. Spend a whole week of my precious summer holiday with a mad Uncle Montgomery in some crummy little country town. I just can't believe it, he protested. What in heaven's name have I done to deserve this? Oh, honestly, Dougie, you really make it sound as though I'm sending you off to prison, his mother had replied with a laugh. And you know that's simply not the case, Your father has gone off on a business trip. I've decided to go along with him this time. And quite frankly, I think, it's high time you met my brother. Your only uncle, I might add, and got to know him just a little. Now, granted, he is rather eccentric, and keeping in touch with him has been almost impossible. What with his gallivanting around the world and disappearing into jungles and so forth for years and years on end. But believe me, my dear, he is far from mad, despite your father's insistence to the contrary. In fact, he's quite brilliant. And now that he's finally settled down, well, for the time being at least, he's extremely anxious to meet you. He was simply thrilled at the prospect of you going there for a visit. After all, last time he saw you was at your christening. But, Mother, I'm 10 years old, for crying out loud. You really don't have to send me off to some strange relative. Well, I'm perfectly capable of staying at home by myself. Don't be ridiculous, Douglas, his mother replied. If you were left alone in this house for just 2 minutes, you'd probably burn it down. No. I'm afraid, really, you have no choice in the matter, dear. And besides, I'm quite certain you'll have an absolutely wonderful time. Your uncle is a most remarkable person, and the two of you will get on like a house on fire. Trust me, The week will fly by, and you'll be sorry when you have to come home." So, 3 weeks later, Douglas had shuffled off to the station, complete with suitcase and a grumpy disposition, kissed goodbye, and placed on a train for Ballsbury, the town in which his mysterious uncle lived. "My uncle must be completely bonkers," Douglas thought in a panic. "No one in their right mind could live in such a house. Then again, perhaps he's a vampire, you know. Only vampires and Frankenstein's monsters could call this place home." These horrible thoughts and many others just like them plagued Douglas' overactive imagination as he stood before his uncle's house. But trying to be as rational as possible under the circumstances, Douglas did his best to put his fears behind him and began to follow the narrow path up the hill, making his way through clumps of wild grass and waist-high poppies, unpruned, rose-hip cluttered rose bushes, and masses of Jimson weed and nettles and blackjacks, which stuck to his trousers and his socks, and dandelions and trails of morning glory, until he finally reached the oak door at the foot of the tower. Affixed to the arch above the door was a shiny bronze bell with a long chain attached to it. He presumed, this was going to be the doorbell, as there was nothing else around that resembled one. So Douglas jumped up and gave the chain a good hard pull. This resulted in an exceedingly loud bang, which startled a few birds that had settled in some of the nearby trees. Then, just when Douglas was beginning to wonder whether he should give the chain another tug, he heard footsteps approaching the door from the inside of the house. These were followed by the sound of a key turning in a rusty lock. And finally, a protesting creak, the door flew open. Standing before Douglas was a short, elderly man. But what he lacked in height, he certainly made up for in girth, for he had a large belly which bulged over his trousers, somewhat like the middle of the hill on which he lived. He also had a large round head covered in a mass of thick, curly grey hair. His clean-shaven face was heavily wrinkled, and he stared at Douglas with large, bespectacled eyes. The man had obviously been running or climbing stairs because his face was flushed and he was out of breath. For a moment he seemed confused. Without looking at Douglas, he yelled, "Mr. Baxter, I told you once, I've told you 1,000 times, kindly leave the mail in the letterbox at the bottom of the drive." Then his eyes focused on Douglas. "Is John Baxter on leave again?" he inquired. "That man is always on holiday. Well, I suppose you must be the new postman then," he concluded, not giving Douglas a chance to reply. "A bit young, aren't you? Well, whatever. As long as you know that I like my letters pasted in the letterbox, no matter how decrepit it may look. It's truly such a bother to rush to the door only to find it's the postman. Not only is it an anticlimax, to say the least, but it's also exceedingly strenuous for someone living in such a large house. And I hope you get my drift, young man." But I'm not the postman," exclaimed Douglas. I'm not the postman? Oh, I should have guessed you're a salesman of some sort. Well, whatever it is you're flogging, I really don't have the time or the inclination. Now, good day to you. Then, with a disgruntled huff, he swiftly turned and charged back into the house. No, but please, you don't understand, Douglas insisted. "My name is Douglas Walker." The door, which was almost closed by this time, stopped in mid-swing and then slowly began to reopen. Walker, of course. Jumping ginger beer bottles, you're my sister's Elizabeth's son, exclaimed the little man, grabbing Douglas' hand, shaking it furiously. Why, last time I saw you were just a baby, and look at you now, all grown and spitting image of your father, I dare say. Well, that could be worse. You could look like great Uncle Bartholomew, and he's not a pretty picture, I can tell you. And a face, you're a bit like a squashed poodle. Can you believe it? I completely forgot that today was the day of your arrival. I feel terrible about it. I've treated you abominably. It's unforgivable. Although, in my defence, I have to say that things have been rather hectic round here of late, and my mind has been, elsewhere. But I tell you in all sincerity that I've been so looking forward to your visit, and I guarantee that we'll do some wonderful things during your stay, and have a simply marvellous adventures. Oh, yes, I'm sure we will, Douglas murmured. I'm getting carried away with myself again. After all, you must be extremely tired after your long journey, and hungry in the bargain, Well, exactly, just as I thought. Come in, I'll show you to your room. And since it's well past breakfast, not quite lunchtime, I think we'll have ourselves a proper brunch. What do you say to that, young man? Well, yes, sir. That'll be fine. Excellent. Oh, by the way, if you like, you can call me Uncle Monty. Yes, I think that has a nice ring to it. How about if I call you Dougie? Douglas, it's so formal, isn't it? I mean, do you mind at all? Oh, no, not at all, Uncle Monty, Douglas replied. That's perfect, said Uncle Monty, grabbing Douglas' suitcase. Now, follow me. I think you are going to like your room. It has a superb view, and I'm quite sure you've never been in anything like it before. Oh, and please close the door behind you, would you? Douglas did as he was told, and once inside, he found himself in a large circular entrance hall. Oriental rugs covered the stone floors. Paintings adorned the curved walls, as did clocks of all shapes and sizes, which sort of filled the room with a wonderful melody of ticking sounds. Leading off the hall were 3 seemingly endless passages, while in the middle a wide wooden spiral staircase climbed straight up through the ceiling. It was this staircase that Douglas' uncle chose as his route, and he began to climb it so rapidly that Douglas had to run after him to keep up. Higher and higher they climbed until, eventually, the staircase wound its way through a trapdoor, and Douglas found himself inside yet another room. The room was smaller than the hall, and it had a domed ceiling. An old wardrobe stood against one wall, and keeping it company were a small bed, an exceedingly dusty chest of drawers, with an equally dusty porcelain wash basin resting on its top. The room was flooded with sunlight that just poured in unrestrained through a huge round window. Having noticed the window, it didn't take Douglas long to realise he was inside the dome at the top of the tower, which he'd first seen while gazing up at the house from the foot of the hill. Peering through the dusty glass pane, he observed that from this distance that the letterbox was now a tiny structure, quite lost in its surroundings, while the stone path was a mere scar on the hillside. The view, however, was simply fantastic. Douglas could see rolling hills and a railway that carved its way through them, and a good portion of Ballsbury and beyond. But while he stood entranced by the wonderful view before him, his uncle was not in as tranquil a state. In fact, the man was running around the room like a hamster on a wheel, making futile attempts at dusting the furniture with his handkerchief. This, however, only served to send clouds of dust wafting into the air, which then just returned to settle on everything, including furniture that hadn't been dusty in the first place. Eventually, reaching a peak of frustration, Montgomery Jones said, No, this just won't do. This won't do at all. No nephew of mine is going to sleep in a dust-ridden room. With that, he rushed towards the window and began to pull at a very large brass lever above it. The lever was slightly out of Montgomery Jones' reach, so in order to get a firm grip, he jumped up and began to swing on it with his feet about an inch from the ground. Naturally, these antics caught Douglas' attention. What are you doing, Uncle Monty?
Well, I'm actually in the process of trying to open this window. The latch is just a little stiff, you know.
Uncle Montgomery explained in a somewhat strained voice.
But a bit of a good swinging always does the job.
With a loud squeak, the latch slid downwards, catching the little man off guard and making him lose his grip and fall onto the bed, which responded with a disapproving groan. With the latch no longer securing it firmly in its frame, the window began to slide open. As it did, a sudden powerful gust of wind blew into the room. It encircled all the dust and sucking it out through the opening like a giant invisible vacuum cleaner. As it did so, it produced a strange moan that sounded like On hearing this, Douglas' uncle jumped up, bowed, and cried,
"An anchor, great wind of the hill. You may take your leave."
This was really very strange. What followed was stranger still, for the wind appeared to understand the man, and producing another loud moan and ruffling Montgomery Jones' grey curls, it sped out of the room, pushing the window closed as it left, the latch falling back into place with a resounding thud.
"Well, there you are, my boy," said Monty with a triumphant smile. "Now, you've a dust-free room, what?"
Uncle Monty, were you actually speaking to the wind a moment ago?
"Yes, I most certainly was," Montgomery Jones answered matter-of-factly. "Now, unpack your belongings, please."
"But, Uncle Montgomery, the wind... I mean, the wind understood you," cried Douglas.
"Well, I should jolly well hope so. Otherwise, I'd be totally insane, you know. Now, hurry up and put your things away, will you?"
"But, Uncle Montgomery..."
"Oh, dear, it appears I've forgotten how inquisitive little boys are," said Montgomery Jones with a sigh. "The thing is, when a wind wails, my boy, the sound it produces is not just any old sound, right? In fact, it's actually murmuring the name of the hill about which it blows. You see, most winds are continuously on the move. They're either sweeping over oceans, roaring through forests, or whistling through ravines, and generally they just never have time to settle down. But sometimes, you see, a small wind, tired of its wanderings, may become attracted to a particular spot, like a hill, for instance. And over the course of many years, it may become part of the hill, and always call out the name of the hill whenever it blows. But what has that got to do with talking to the wind?" inquired Douglas. "Well, I was coming to that," replied his uncle. "You see, legend has it that if a man can learn the name of the hill about which a particular wind blows, and he calls that name out loud, or even thinks it hard enough, the wind will come to him and perform any task he may ask it. Within his capabilities, of course."
"Well, all right, Uncle. Then how is it that no one else, has ever spoken to a wind before?" Douglas challenged. "After all, there's no shortage of hills, is there?"
"That's true indeed, but not just any run-of-the-mill hill can attract the wind. No. No, the kind of hill I'm talking about has to be very special indeed. And apart from the one we're standing on, there happen to be only a few more like it anywhere in the world. Then, of course, hardly anyone remembers ancient lore anymore, and even if they did, very few would believe it to be true. And last, but not least, before you can speak to a wind, you must find out the name of the hill about which it blows, a name given to the hill by the sorcerers who lived in ancient times. But since asking a hill its name generally meets with little success, very few have ever discovered these names, with the exception of just a tiny number of extremely fortunate people, such as yours truly," concluded Douglas's uncle smugly.
"Uncle Monty, you're talking about magic?"
exclaimed Douglas. Precisely, agreed Montgomery Jones. But, Uncle Monty, there is no such thing as magic. No such thing as magic, yelled Montgomery Jones, clearly astounded. How can you say that, Douglas Walker? Of course there's such a thing as magic. It's as plain as the nose on your face. Well, whatever do you mean? Well, is it not magical to witness a shooting star as it races across a black velvet sky? Is it not magical when mushrooms pop up over the summer shower, or when an ugly caterpillar transforms itself into a magnificent, multicolored butterfly? No, that's not magic, that's nature, Douglas retorted. Exactly, shrieked Montgomery Jones. Don't you see, my boy? They're one and the same. The only thing that separates nature and magic is imagination. While just a dash of imagination, talking to the wind becomes as simple as, well, I don't know, as simple as, oh, I've got it. Yes, as simple as making a peanut butter and sardine sandwich. How about that? A distant medley of clock chimes sounded from the entrance hall, and upon hearing this, Montgomery Jones immediately produced a small gold pocket watch from his waistcoat. Good gracious, he exclaimed. Would you believe it's already 11 o'clock? Yes, and on the subject of sandwiches, of course, I haven't given you any food. Oh, dear. Your mother would be furious if she knew about this. Well, I suppose you'd better leave your things for the moment and come and get something to eat this instant. There's no doubt about it. Food is a priority when growing boys. Well, after brunch, I think I'll show you round the house. What do you say to that, Dougie? Oh, well, that would be absolutely great, Uncle Monty, Douglas replied, genuinely looking forward to the tour. Yes, well, she isn't Buckingham Palace, but this house is not like any other. That I can assure you, said Montgomery Jones proudly. Now, come along. Let's go and see what's in the fridge, shall we? So off they went. It wasn't long before Douglas and his uncle were down the stairs and back in the entrance hall. From there, he followed his uncle into a long passage, which led past a considerable number of locked rooms. And on the walls hung large paintings of strange landscapes and faded portraits. Eventually, the passage led into a huge dining room with a long, massive wooden table on which rested ornate, tarnished silver candlestick holders. And noticing untrimmed ivy peering through one of the room's large windows, Douglas realized he was in the mansion portion of the house. Leading directly off the dining room was the kitchen. Once he'd been given a seat at the kitchen table, Douglas discovered that his uncle had used the word brunch, quite literally. For Montgomery Jones set to work at once, and soon the table was laden to capacity with typical breakfast fare: buttered toast and marmalade, a gigantic pot of tea, scrambled eggs, and a huge plate of steaming syrup-smothered pancakes. In addition to these items of food, there were also what one would expect for lunch: a large pile of corned beef sandwiches and cold roast chicken. When everything had been prepared and the pans had given a few final sizzles and the old kettle one last hiss, Montgomery Jones threw himself into a chair opposite Douglas, mopped his face with a large handkerchief, and announced, "Well, Douglas, no standing on ceremony around here. Tuck in, what?" Then, staring very intently at the plate of sandwiches, he added, "Actually, I have to say that I'm feeling rather peckish myself, and I think I might just join you." And that's exactly what he did do. As Montgomery Jones had promised, the tour of his house commenced promptly after brunch, and Douglas found himself following his uncle once again down the long passage. What's behind all these doors, Uncle Monty?" asked Douglas. "Oh, rooms, of course, my boy. Rooms filled to the brim with bits and pieces that I've collected over the years. You see, according to Mrs. Brown, my biggest weakness is that I won't throw anything away. However, my policy is keep everything. You just never know when something may come in handy. Who's Mrs. Brown? Oh, that's my housekeeper, replied Montgomery Jones. She comes in every Monday to do a little dusting, mopping, ranting and raving, that sort of thing. Come to think of it, thank goodness she's here only once a week. If that woman had more time on her hands, she'd tidy this house, to such an extent, I'd never be able to find anything in it again. By this time, Douglas and his uncle had reached the end of the passage. Soon they'd rushed through the entrance hall into yet another passage, which faced the one they'd just come through. The second passage was dark and narrow, and flanked by rough, damp-smelling walls. Descending from the end of it was a flight of uneven stairs which sort of slithered steeply in the gloomy depths. It won't be long now before we're right in the heart of the old castle, and then you'll be able to see the best part of the house. Don't worry about the gloom, just watch your step on. These stairs can be quite treacherous, cautioned Montgomery Jones. Where exactly are we? Asked Douglas, somewhat disorientated. Well, at this moment, we are using the stairway that leads directly to the castle hall. Once upon a time, when the whole castle was still in existence, this was the way to the dungeons. Now, it's just a shortcut to the hall itself. See, we're here already. The stairway had come to an abrupt end at a large door. Do you mean to tell me that this place actually had dungeons? Explained Douglas. Why, of course. Most castles worth their salt have dungeons. And I'm afraid the ones that existed in this castle now make up part of the hall. In fact, that's all the castle portion of the house is. It's just one colossal room. You'll see for yourself. This was indeed true, for the door opened to reveal a huge hall with an arched, cathedral-like ceiling as high as an aeroplane's hangar, and glaring ferociously from each of its four corners was a gigantic stone gargoyle. The hall's vast grey marble floor was bare, except for a note-cluttered desk which stood conspicuously amidst all its emptiness. But what made the hall so extraordinary were its walls, which were lined from floor to ceiling with dusty wooden shelves, and these were packed to capacity with books, thousands and thousands of them, more than Douglas had ever seen before. Books of all shapes and sizes, some leather-bound and pristine, and some in an advanced state of disintegration. It was truly an astounding sight. What do you think of this, Ted, my boy, shouted Montgomery Jones joyously, his voice sounding hollow within the huge stone walls. It's absolutely amazing, said Douglas. There must be more books in here than in the city public library. No, I have no doubt, agreed Douglas' uncle with a chuckle. But how did you get them all? Well, actually, they came with the house, explained Montgomery Jones. In fact, that is precisely why I bought it, for the books and the view from the tower. The early afternoon sun poured into the hall through the skylights, reflecting off the marble floor, and bathed the entire hall in a soft yellow light. What kind of books are they? Asked Douglas. Well, there are all kinds. There are books here on everything you can imagine. Well, I even discovered a cookery book containing a recipe for roast dodo. You see, Teague, most of these books are hundreds of years old, and many of them tell of things long forgotten. For instance, and what is most important to me at the moment, there are books about the lost world of fantasy that existed in ancient times together with our own world reality. The lost world of fantasy, Uncle Monty? Look, I'm really finding all this stuff rather hard to believe, exclaimed Douglas. Oh, have a seat, Douglas, replied Monty Jones, pulling a chair out from under the desk, and I'll just try and make a little sense of it. You see, once upon a time, the world was a fabulous place. Not only was it a real one, where things were like they are now, where fire was hot and ice was cold and apples fell off trees, but it was also a world
of fantasy where dragons slept on mountains of treasure, sorcerers were mighty spells, and alchemists turned lead into gold. It was a truly wonderful world to live in, but as time went by, people became more rational and scientific. And now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but as a result, the fantastic aspect of this world started to separate from the world of reality, and soon both worlds are completely split apart. The world of fantasy just disappeared, never to be seen by people like us again. This happened a very long time ago, and it also happened gradually, with the dragons disappearing first, until finally everything else, down to the last genie in its lamp, had vanished from our world forever. "I'm confused," said Douglas. When we were at the top of the tower, you told me that magic was still all around us, and what's more, I saw you speak to the wind. If that's not magic, then what is?
Well, you see, Dougie, there are two types of magic, said Montgomery Jones. The first is the kind that can be explained, while the second just can't. For example, when you see a beautiful rainbow after a storm, it is not hard to see it as something magical. However, if you were to talk to a rainbow expert about what causes the rainbow to appear, he or she will tell you that it is simply the sunlight being split into many colours as it passes through the droplets of water. So what seems magical can be explained quite easily. But if I were to jump up into the air and begin to fly like a bird, there's no way that anyone could explain why or how I was doing it. There would be no sort of scientific or logical explanation for such a phenomenon. It would, therefore, be the kind of magic that is totally beyond explanation. It is the kind of magic that we have lost, Dougie. And what I am searching for is that world that contains this very magic.
But Uncle Monty, if we're living in a world of reality where no unexplained magic can exist, how were you able to speak to the wind? Asked Douglas, starting to get the picture, but still somewhat confused.
Fantastic question, yelled Montgomery excitedly. You have just touched on the most important part of this explanation. If the world of fancy had indeed totally broken away from the world of reality, there would be no hope at all of finding the world of fantasy, because there would be no place in this world to start looking for it. Fortunately, that is not the case. There are still tiny remnants of it left in various corners of the world. And these remnants, although well hidden, are in fact the passages that lead directly to that lost world. It just so happens, added Montgomery proudly, that this house is one of those places.
That's absolutely amazing, exclaimed Douglas. Do you mean to say this whole house is what, magical?
Well, kind of, replied his uncle. You see, hundreds of years ago, this portion of the house used to be part of a complete castle that stood on this hill, and in it lived a powerful sorcerer called Haron.
Haron?
Yes, that was his name, even though it was a stupid name for a sorcerer. Nobody dared tell him that. He had a terrible temper, and when he lost it, it was not a good idea to be in the vicinity. At any rate, he used to live in the castle, and as a result, most of it became enchanted except for the hall, for some strange reason, which I haven't been able to figure out yet. When the sorcerer finally disappeared with the world of fantasy, the parts of the castle that were enchanted gradually began to crumble and disappear as well. But some of the stones still remain stuck to this hall, and they've been here ever since. They do not have much power, but they do allow some of the legends of old to survive, but only on this hill. More like the legend of the wind of the hill, to which you've already been a witness. Does that mean that the hill can only have its own wind if it still retains some of the magic left behind by the world of fantasy? Oh, correct, Kati, yes. And as I told you in the tower, there are not many of these hills left. and even if there were, it would be almost impossible to find out the names of these hills. So the legends can never be used. Enough about the world of fantasies and such, declared Montgomery Jones. It's time for a little exploration of the countryside. With that, Monty darted off at his usual pace, and in no time at all he'd reached the end of the hall with Dougie close at his heels. Douglas was just about to ask what there was to see in yet another book-lined wall and how this related to the countryside, when his uncle approached the fifth shelf from the bottom, pulled out a book, and began to grope about within the space it had occupied, as if, searching for something. Then a triumphant grin appeared on his face as his hand pulled at something that gave way with a loud click. With the noise, a portion of shelving and books swung away from the wall on concealed hinges to reveal a narrow, cobweb-filled passage. Without losing a moment, the little man rushed into it, beckoning his nephew to follow. No sooner had Douglas stepped inside, the concealed door shut silently behind them. Where exactly are we going now? Asked Douglas. Nowhere out of the ordinary, explained Montgomery Jones. This is just a passage that leads to a small exit a little way down the hill. The reason why I chose to go this way is simply because of that wonderful secret doorway. It always leaves me with the feeling that I'm in a spy movie, 007 and all that stuff. Soon they reached what appeared to be a dead end. Douglas discovered, however, after watching his uncle give the end of the passage a good push, that apparently solid rock face was nothing more than a cleverly disguised stone slab. As he looked on, it swung away to reveal a tiny round exit, overgrown with weeds. Having shown Douglas around the entire house, Montgomery Jones took his nephew for a walk around the surrounding countryside, and only when the glorious spring day had begun to slowly fade into evening, and the setting sun had turned the sky a deep orange, did they return to the wonderful house on its enchanted hill. If you've ever been out in the country at night, you'll be able to appreciate what Douglas saw as he peered upward through the giant window of the room. For the night sky was simply smothered with bright, glimmering stars, and amongst them was a big, beautiful banana moon, which illuminated his room with its pale radiance. And with his gaze entranced by this celestial splendor, and his thoughts preoccupied with the lost world and magical winds, it was not too long before Douglas was fast asleep.